Mr. Customer?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The next witnesses which the city will be calling as part of its case in chief is a panel consisting of 2 transportation witnesses, Dan Terzievsky, who is a member of city staff, and Carl Wang, who is a member of the consulting firm HDR. Mr. Kahar will be leading the witnesses through their evidence in chief. I'm doing my best to make myself redundant here. But before we call them, we just wanted to clarify the issues regarding the scope of their evidence in light of the tribunal's direction from yesterday. So you'll recall that following the motion and the decision made by the tribunal with respect to what's properly the scope of the phase 1 hearing and what should be deferred to phase 2, you directed us to go through the exercise with Mr. Streisfield of reviewing the issues list as well as the witness statements of the relevant witnesses sorry, can you hear me okay? In an attempt to clarify what properly remains within the scope of phase 1 and what is now deferred to phase 2. We did engage in that exercise overnight. We provided to Mr. Streisfield what we considered to be issues that were either now entirely or partially to be deferred to phase 2 pursuant to the tribunal's direction. We also indicated which evidence in the relevant transportation witness statements we considered were no longer appropriately within phase 1. Unfortunately, in the short time we had, we were unable to reach agreement in many respects. In the interest of proceeding with this hearing as expeditiously as possible, this is what we're proposing, subject to your concurrence. We propose to go ahead and call our witnesses. We will be very carefully seeking to limit their evidence in chief in accordance with what we consider to be in accordance with the tribunal's direction. Obviously, any evidence that is elicited from them would be fair game for cross-examination from any other party. But to the extent that we do not elicit certain evidence from the witnesses because in our view, it goes beyond the scope of phase 1, it will be our position that such evidence that we don't call would not be appropriate for cross-examination, and we will be reserving our right to object if and when that arises. And it remains our hope over the weekend that we can try to continue to reach agreement. Oh, and the other thing I did want to point out, you may recall toward the end of yesterday's session, an issue arose that Mr. Cherniak raised in connection with one of his client's issues on the issues list, and it had to do with the Justice Drive extension in the Southeast Quadrant. We did have an opportunity to discuss the issue overnight with Mr. Cherniak, and he has agreed that that issue is appropriately deferred to the phase 2 hearing. So on that basis, we do not propose to be calling any evidence from our witnesses to deal specifically with that issue raised by Mr. Cherniak's client.
And I can confirm that that is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we've got Mr. Terzevsky. All right. And Mr. Wang as well, and we're calling them both in a panel. I think what you're gonna need, Mr. Chair, is Exhibit 2, which is the city's compendium of witness statements, and the reply witness statements, which is Exhibit 3. So 3 is a thin book that looks like this. That's right. That's correct. That's Exhibit 3.
Set.
So at tab 9 of Exhibit 2, you'll find Mr. Trzywski's witness statement.
Just hang on for a minute. Ms. Burton? You going to deal with the 2 witnesses that are coming up? Swear them in? Swear them in?
I just opened the tab I was told to open.
Swearing them in?
Oh, first. It did not seem like a normal hearing to me in any way, so forgive me for the swearing. Do you prefer to be sworn in or to affirm?
Swear. So,
Could you select the Bible up front there?
Microphone. Ms. Burton?
I'm pressing the microphone.
oh, there we go.
Good. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Second witness? Second panel witness? Ms. Burton?
And do you prefer to swear or to affirm, sir? To swear. To swear. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you.
Hey, Mr. Tahar.
Trzywski's witness statement is at tab 9 of Exhibit 2. And if you turn within that tab to Appendix A, you'll find his CV. And sir, if you could provide the tribunal
An overview of your past experiences, education, and work experiences.
Okay, certainly. I'm a graduate of the University of Toronto. I graduated in 1998 with a Bachelor of Applied Science in Civil Engineering. In terms of licenses and certifications, I'm licensed as a professional engineer in the province of Ontario. I'm also certified as a professional traffic operations engineer with the Transportation Professional Certification Board. I'm also a member of various associations, including IT, TAC, OTC, and MEA. In terms of work experience, I have 20.
Excuse me, is there any, are all council aware of his qualifications? Have you had dealings with him during the process? Or do you have any issues on his qualifications? Anybody?
Can you just ask what you propose to qualify him as, and then we will say we agree? I just want to hear what you propose to qualify him, if that's okay.
Sure, in the area of transportation planning.
Any issue? We go then. Okay. Mr. Tahar?
Thank you. I'm now going to turn to Mr. Wang then. And Mr. Wang's witness statement is at tab 8, his CV Appendix A of that. And I suppose I'll ask the question as to whether there is any other party that would take issue with his qualification in the area of transportation engineering.
Any issues?
Excuse me, just for the witnesses' edification. Yesterday, I had asked that the CV review be extremely limited because we have many witnesses for this hearing. That's why we're going to. Any objections?
Appreciate that. Thank you.
So that there are no objections, we'll proceed then.
Thank you. So, Mr. Trzywski, if you could begin by letting me know, or letting the tribunal know, how your involvement in this matter.
There we go. My involvement with the development of this KDA secondary plan and the zoning bylaw was in the capacity of as the director of development, engineering, and transportation at the city. From that perspective, I guided and directed my team of transportation engineers and analysts and staff to provide input into that process in terms of developing the policies and some guidance from that perspective. In terms of preparation for this hearing, I guess I've visited the site several times since 2017 on several occasions through the various iterations of this plan. I've also reviewed the relevant documents, including but not limited to traffic studies prepared by Lee Consulting, relevant sections of the city's official plan, relevant sections of the region's official plan, as well as the Richmond Hill staff report receiving final approval on May 14th, 2020, and the proposed Yonge and Bernard KDA secondary plan and related zoning bylaw, and the detailed design plan prepared for the Yonge Street Bus Rapid Transit Terminal, as well as I've reviewed the concept plan prepared for 11005 Yonge Street, which is North Elgin Center's property, but I suspect that's subject to phase 2 of this hearing. So.
That's right. And can you touch on what areas of testimony you're going to be going into?
So my evidence will be primarily focused on the perspective of transportation policies and how this KDA plan and zoning bylaw are relevant from that perspective, as well as from a transportation plan perspective, to the extent that I will not be providing any evidence with respect to parking. That will be the other panel.
And from a looking at the secondary plan, sir, can you provide us some context as to how the policies in that secondary plan fit within various provincial policies that relate to transportation?
As per Ms. Anderson's evidence, as you are all aware, Yonge and Bernard has been designated as a KDA area in accordance with Regional Official Plan Policy 5.431 and Section 4.4 of the Richmond Hill Official Plan. That's the part 1. As you also heard, KDAs are planned to be significant intensification areas where there are opportunities for the redevelopment of lands for mixed-use residential and employment uses at both high-density and medium-density built form and scale. Besides the regional centers, as you've heard, these are expected to be the highest level of intensification within the regional corridor. To accommodate this intensification, KDA policies are expected to facilitate a fundamental policy shift from suburban to urban form, which is more pedestrian-oriented, cyclist-oriented, and transit-oriented from a transportation perspective. At the same time, given the levels of planned intensification for these KDAs, it's expected that they'll still be fairly significant traffic generators. As such, from a transportation perspective, there's a need to plan these KDAs in a comprehensive manner, which includes planning for public streets, pedestrian and cycling facilities, transit infrastructure, and other transportation infrastructure in order to be able to support the planned urban intensification and ensure that the streets can support all modes of transportation, including walking, cycling, transit, and automobile use. York Region Official Plan Policy 5.432C acknowledges this and requires that a secondary plan be prepared for all key development in areas, including this one. From a transportation perspective, Regional Official Plan Policy 5.4.6 requires that that secondary plan identify the establishment, implementation, and or the continuation of a fine-grained street grid that incorporates sidewalks and bicycles. It also requires that that secondary plan develop policies that sequence development in an orderly way, so coordinated with the provision of human services, transit, and other infrastructure. The requirement for a secondary plan is further reiterated in Richmond Hill's official plan, Policy 4.41, which directs the city shall prepare a secondary plan for the Yonge and Bernard KDA in accordance with the policies set out in Section 5.1 of the OP. From a transportation perspective, policy 5.1.5 requires that the city identify the following: the location, role, and requirements of street, transit, pedestrian, and cycling facilities. It also requires that policies related to TDM and parking be included in the secondary plan. Also requires the necessary investments required for the secondary plan area to include requirements for transportation infrastructure.
Sir, is there any history you want to highlight to the tribunal that's relevant as it relates to the transportation policies in the secondary plan? And I'd ask you to keep in mind that some of this has already been addressed by Ms. Anderson.
Yeah. Yes, I think Ms. Anderson has already provided a detailed chronology of the process that this KDA has gone through. So I'm going to touch on it basically from the perspective of transportation work that was done. I guess if we dial back to the beginning, the Yonge Bernard KDA plan, the work was commenced in November of 2016. And as part of that work, the BA group was retained to evaluate the transportation impacts and identify infrastructure needs to support the KDA at a density of 3.0 FSI. Through that work, BA group identified that a 3.0 FSI could be supported. And it also identified, in order to support that 3.0 FSI, that a fine-grained public ring road system would be required in all 4 quadrants of the KDA, and the introduction of a signalized intersection north of Bernard would also be required to appropriately provide the connectivity and capacity throughout the entire KDA from a transit, pedestrian, cycling, and vehicular perspective in order to support the density. As you're aware, on November 20th, 2017, the recommendations, including those made in the BA group report, were adopted by council. Ms. Anderson, I think, provided details as to what transpired between that date and present. So I won't go into the detail of that. And I'll skip to, I guess, May or June of 2019, when council directed staff to have a second look at the KDA secondary plan in light of the new regional and provincial policies, directions. So with this new direction, staff then undertook further consultation with York Region and York Region Transit, as well as landowners of the KDA and its surrounding neighborhoods, as well as stakeholders in the broader community, with a view to reevaluate the secondary plan policies and possibly bring forward proposed modifications to the KDA secondary plan and zoning bylaw. So as part of that reevaluation, HDR Consulting was retained to do a couple of things. The first was to peer review the work and assumptions of the original work that was completed by the BA group with respect to the 2017 KDA plan. And then to evaluate an expanded transportation network to understand the potential for constraints in the broader transportation network, which was an issue that was raised with respect to the first plan, that the boundary was scoped down too far. So we wanted to expand the boundary and make sure that any further intensification didn't have broader impacts. And finally, their role was to also examine whether any additional densities could be supported in the KDA from a transportation perspective. So the HDR analysis at a high level, and I'll let Mr. Wang go into the details of that analysis, but at a high level found that a 4.0 FSI could be supported, provided that the KDA continued to provide for the public ring road system and the traffic signal on Yonge Street north of Bernard, and that certain planned regional and provincial infrastructure projects were actually in place, and that certain transit modal splits on Yonge Street were achieved, as well as on the adjacent corridors of Bayview and Bathurst. For Yonge Street, the transit modal split target that would need to be achieved would be 30%, and on the adjacent 2 corridors, Bathurst and Bayview, they would respectively need to achieve a 20% transit modal split. With respect to the latter 2 points, HDR, with respect to the uncertainty of the latter 2 points, HDR recommended that a holding provision be introduced to ensure that the growth of the KDA beyond the 3.0 FSI aligned with these regional infrastructure projects as well as these transit modal split targets. As you're aware, in May 2020, the proposed modifications to the secondary plan and the respective zoning bylaw were completed and brought forward in the staff report, along with the HDR transportation study to council, and they were approved. I'd like to say, from a perspective, some of those modifications also included some minor adjustments to the public ring road system alignment that was originally proposed in 2017. And there was some very minor alignments. I guess the most significant of those changes was also the deletion of Justice Connection, which we will now defer to phase 2. That's my understanding. And the other sort of biggest item that was introduced was the holding bylaw provision in order to support a higher density for the KDA. So on that note.
Great, thank you, sir. So Mr. Wang, I think where we're now hopeful to go is how your involvement, or rather, how did you get involved in this matter? And specifically, when were you retained and what did you do?
HDR Corporation was retained in late September 2019, and I was the project manager on the HDR team that performed the peer review study as well as the transportation update. I was one of the primary authors of a draft report that was also submitted in February 2020. And based on comments received from stakeholders and the public, I also was a primary author for the report that was dated May 2020, which is the final version.
And why was an update study completed?
As Mr. Teske mentioned, the update study was prepared in response to the May 2019 council resolution, which directed staff to re-examine the KDA and to engage the public further in response to updated provincial policies.
And you reviewed the BA study. Did you agree with their findings?
Yes, to expand on that, although there were several assumptions and inputs that we raised could be updated, revised, at the time that BA did their study, which was for a different density and for a different horizon compared to the latest report. We did not, in our view, we found that FSI of 3 was supportable. And it was based on BA's proposed road network. Some of the assumptions that we have identified that could have been updated was to look at a potentially a higher mode split, transit mode split for 2031 and for any horizon years later in the future, in which we did look at 2041 in our study. Not all the road improvements were explicitly accounted for in the BA study, and this has to do with expanding the study area to include other road network improvements beyond the boundaries of the KDA. We also determined that if you didn't take a broader view of the study area, you're limiting yourself to having looked at background growth that could not potentially divert onto these new road improvements. And lastly, we also determined that more could have been done in terms of the active transportation network and analysis to look at what additional improvements could be done to improve cycling and walking within the KDA and to connect to other neighborhoods surrounding the KDA.
Okay, so to be clear here, comparing the BA report to the update that you did, what were some of the significant changes that were incorporated into the update?
As mentioned, we did look at a new horizon year of 2041 instead of 2031. The city felt that it was potentially not achievable to reach a FSI of 4 by 2031. So that horizon year was expanded, and this has implications on the forecast as well as long-term needs for the KDA. Another major input or change is the land use forecast for the KDA. The city provided a new set of land use forecasts associated with the 4 FSI for us to test. And this included a higher residential component, as well as higher office and higher retail GFA within the KDA. Another major component of our revisions or update was expanding the study area to include downstream intersections and impacts. This included looking further towards Bathurst and Bayview Avenue, as well as to look south to Major Mackenzie Drive. In association with that larger study boundary, we also looked at a new forecast methodology, which consisted of using a transportation model that was provided by the region of York, and to use that model to analyze the implications of the KDA on the surrounding network. And associated with that 2041 horizon year and the model, we also tested different modal split assumptions, specifically looking at the potential for higher transit mode splits. And lastly, we were also asked to address the question of public versus private roads for the proposed network that stemmed from the BA study.
So how was the study conducted, and what steps did you take?
So one of the things unique with this study is that we were starting from a point of a brand new study. We definitely leveraged the foundation provided by BA, and we looked at updating some key areas. So in conducting the study, we did a review and collected any new data. This includes traffic counts, transit data, and active transportation information. We then examined whether existing conditions were to be updated. For the most part, we use the same traffic counts and data as the BA study, given that the YRT and the BRT was under construction on Yonge Street. So that limited the ability to recount. We also looked at updating the background conditions, which is updating the forecast to 2031 and 2041 using the transportation model. Next, we looked at updating the trip generation based on the new land use provided by the city. This would generate a new set of land use for the various time periods, and we focus on the AM peak hour as the most critical time period for the study. After that, we assigned the traffic that we generated based on the new land use and used the full network that was now part of the larger study area. And lastly, we conducted traffic analysis of the updated forecast for the larger study area, and we conducted sensitivity analysis using the various densities ranging from 3 and 4 FSI. Based on that analysis, we then proposed recommendations that would either confirm the BA proposed network or come up with new mitigation measures in addition to what BA proposed. This also included not just the road network, but also included active transportation as well as transit facilities to determine if there were additional improvements above and beyond what BA proposed.
And when you were talking about the FSI figure from 3 to 4, are you talking about KDA wide?
Correct. The KDA wide number that we were requested to review was 3 and 4 for the KDA, of which at various blocks, it may have a different KDA when you broke it down to the different quadrants.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to ask you now to walk the tribunal through your study on a high level. The study itself is in Exhibit 2. at tab 8, Appendix C.
Okay, in going through the report, I'll pick out key excerpts and I'll reference the page number as well as the major headings. What I would like to start off is 1.2 study purpose, and this is on page 3.
Sorry, yes, tab 8, sub tab C. C as in cat.
And this looks to be very recent.
So Mr. Wang, maybe you can advise the tribunal as to the date of this report and what led to this report being finalized on May 1st, 2020.
Yes, this report is the final version released in May 2020. However, beforehand, there was a draft report completed in February of 2020. And so when we work backwards, we were retained in that late September in preparing for the draft report, and subsequently, based on comments received, we updated the study in May. So I'd like to take the chair to 1.2 study purpose, which is on page 3. And this these 4 bullets basically summarize the key purpose, and most of it has been mentioned in one way or another already, but definitely key in terms of the purpose of the update was to look at all modes, not just roads, to look at a broader study area, to address the key question of whether we can support the high density, and updating recommendations in regard to parking, TDM, active transportation, in addition to determining the timing of these improvements, what phasing may occur, and what strategies and what improvements may have to happen associated with those phasing, as well as the ultimate development towards for FSI. Another key section I want to take you to is 1.3 study area, which is on page 4. So in this section of the report, as mentioned before, we expanded the study area beyond the boundaries of the KDA and looked at the arterial road network that consists of Gamble Road, 19th Avenue to the north, Bathurst and Bayview, which are to the west and east respectively, and Major Mackenzie Drive as well. Although we are looking at this exhibit 1-2 in this report that shows these external intersections, the model that we had available for use actually looked at even a wider boundary that goes all the way to Leslie Street and 404. So we're able to look further downstream to also study those impacts. But the screen lines and the analysis that we'll focus on will be surrounding or be bounded by these 4 key arterials of Gamble, Bayview, Bathurst, and Major Mac.
Mr. Wang, why was it relevant to look at this broader area?
As previously mentioned, the previous BA study had looked at a smaller study area in which they were limited in what road improvements that they could address or incorporate in their analysis. The broader that you go out means that you have the ability to look at traffic diversion and to look at network improvements that could offer those diversions away from Yonge Street, for example, onto those other roads. And it was important to consider the holistic or the network-wide perspective to address the ability for traffic to choose different travel patterns and choices, and not to be limited to just the road network within the KDA. Next, I'd like you to go to 1.4 page on page 5, which is analysis approach. As previously mentioned already, looking at this broader area, we use the translation model to develop the findings and to test various densities and network improvements. We also leveraged the model to look at sensitivities that would address the various improvements by what we call looking at a screen line approach. So when we go further and further out from the study area, it's not feasible to look at every intersection that might be contained in the broader study area. So our focus in terms of our analysis approach was a term what we call screen line. Screen line is imaginary boundary or line that crosses several roads at the same time. So if we refer to a screen line on Bayview, it means that we would capture the traffic that passes through Gamble Road, 19th Avenue. We would also consider traffic that passes through on Elgin Mills, and we would also consider traffic that passes through at Major Mac. So a screen line considers all three of these roads together in a combined approach so that we can look at the capacity for that broader area. Next, I'd like you to take you through to 2.0, the planning context on page 8. So there's been many discussions or evidence already provided in terms of the provincial, regional, and local policies. I won't go into this detail, but in this section, we also document the 10-year capital program. And this was key in our analysis as it set the base network assumption that would go into our analysis. The 10-year capital program includes primarily arterial road improvements, as well as grade separation improvements, specifically at Elgin Mills, just east of Yorkland. Next, on page 16, we describe the regional and local growth context. Before we looked at the KDA specifically, we also wanted to provide a background on the regional growth that's expected, and as well as the local growth context in regard to the KDA and how the KDA fits in within the broad area. And we also indicated here the active development applications that are being considered in this study area as well as adjacent to the KDA. Next, I'd like you to take you through to 4.1 existing conditions on page 20. In conducting our study, we leveraged the existing counts as mentioned previously, which were from the BA study. And these counts were conducted in December 2016 and are considered still relevant with respect to the fact that the Yonge Street BRT is under construction, and any other traffic counts conducted during this time would have resulted in less traffic than was counted back in 2016. We then re-examined the existing conditions based on those counts, and together with an inventory of the road network, with the active transportation network, with the transit network, we reassessed to see whether there were any differences in the existing conditions. Our finding is that there's no change to the existing conditions, with the exception that there's some potential modifications to some of the key assumptions that should be brought forward. One aspect that I want to highlight was the existing mode splits, and that's documented in table 4-3 on page 29 of the HDR report. It's important as we go forward in looking at future mode splits to look at what the existing mode splits are today in this study area. And we broke it down to categorizing it based on residential, office, and retail. And in the upper portion of this table are the mode shares that are listed for different modes, ranging from auto drivers to passengers to transit, walking, and cycling. And then we also looked at some of the adjustments that we made. And we wanted to highlight this because we actually made very conservative assumptions. We actually, if you looked at the transit assumptions for what we found from the top upper rows, we see that transit for retail is 8 and 13%. However, we brought those down back to 5%, which was more realistic in our mind. As well, we also looked at changes to walking for residential. Based on the data, we found that it had a high walking of 23%, and we brought that down to 10%. So in using these more conservative assumptions, we actually are making sure that our future assumptions in regard to these mode splits aren't out of range in terms of what we might expect the KDA to generate in future years. And next, I'd like for you to go to 4.5, safety analysis on page 39. So one update to the BA study was that we included a section and analysis on safety and collision analysis in the KDA. Based on public comments, it was brought to us that whether the KDA would have an impact on safety in this area. And the analysis that we presented in this report shows and documents the history of collisions based on York Region data for the arterial roads, as well as local collision data based on city roads. On the graph that's shown in Exhibit 4-11, on page 40 of that section, we can clearly see that the collision data and the collision statistics has decreased over time between the years of 2014 to 2018. Although the region classifies or designates a list of high collision intersections, of which Yonge Street and Elgin Mills and Yonge Street and Major Back may be a part of, the York region has already initiated measures to improve or to enhance safety at these intersections. These include adding zebra crossings, as well as to ensure that the walking pedestrian crossing times are sufficient for walk and cross these wider arterial roads, as well as to look at potentially changing the potential restriction of no right turns or no left turns during certain phases to ensure that pedestrians have a right of way or crossing without interfering or conflicting with autos. On page 41 and 42 of the section, as well as page 43, and summarized in the graph on page 45, Exhibit 4-13 shows the 5-year collision history of all the city roads within the KDA. And the graph basically confirms that the collision in this area has either decreased or been flat over the last 5 years. And so there isn't an issue of increasing collisions in this area. And this is important context as we look forward in the future. And we'll come on this as we look at the potential impact to safety as we increase volumes from the KDA as well. And next, I would like you to take you to the section on future background growth, which is on page 47 of the report and section 4.6. So in this chapter, we again noted the key planned improvements in terms of road network, as well as any grade crossings, And we also looked beyond 2031, beyond the 10-year plan. The region's transportation master plan also includes road improvements that are in the 10 to 20-year timeframe. And these are summarized on page 47 in terms of the various improvements. This includes widening on Bathurst Street and grade separations on 19th as well, widening on Bayview, and improvements to 404. Next, I'd like to take you through to page 54 of the same section, and to focus on tables 4-12 and 4-13. Although we are using a region model to assess future traffic forecasts within the KDA, we recognize that the model is a region-wide model, and certain adjustments have to be made when you use a region-wide model to study an area that's significantly smaller and more focused. And some of these adjustments are done post-modeling, and some of them are done pre-modeling. In terms of our post-modeling adjustments, we are looking at table 4-12 that indicates that certain adjustments include volume reductions to account for a difference in mode split, as well as to account for potentially changes in assumptions in our model to deal with road capacity. I'll deal with the mode split first. When we use the model compared to what the region has in terms of targets, if the model doesn't represent the target's aspirations or targets of 30% mode split, then we have to make post-model adjustments to achieve or attain those mode splits. And in this case, we applied a very conservative mode split reductions for the key north-south streets in our study area. For example, on Yonge Street, our mode split target based on the region's aspiration is at least 30% by 2041. And when we looked at the forecast for the model, it only contained a mode split of 10%. This means that there should be an adjustment of 20 additional percentage to the volumes in order to reach the aspirations of the region or the policy targets of the region. And to be conservative, when we apply that additional 20%, we actually looked at the lowest volume along the entire stretch of Yonge Street to apply that 20%. We recognize that there's various volume levels across or along the entire street of Yonge Street, but by assuming the lowest link volume and applying that percentage, you're in fact applying even a lower percentage on other sections of Yonge Street. For example, if you had a volume of 1,000 and you apply 20%, that's 200 reduced. However, other sections of the Yonge Street might have 1,200 or 1,400. To be consistent with a reduction, we carried forward that 200 throughout the entire stretch of Yonge Street. So in fact, that 20% is actually less when you consider 1,200 or 1,400 amongst other sections. So we did that for both Bathurst and Bayview as well at a lower target. For Bathurst and Bayview, our target mode split was 20%. And based on various mode splits that exist today, as well as from the model, we further adjusted those by assuming 10% additional adjustment on top of the forecast in order to be consistent with the region's mode split targets. Secondly, to talk about the capacity adjustments, this is simply an adjustment to acknowledge that in the model, there might be an assumption of capacity that is different from the volumes that are actually counted today. If there are volumes today that are exceeding the original capacity of the model, for example, if the model has an assumption of 900 for Elgin Mills, however, the counts today already reviewed, there's already 1,000, it means that there should be an adjustment in the model to match that count. And therefore, we adjusted that to 1,000 as well. So that's the accounting for existing volumes to match the model and actual observed counts. Next, I'd like to also acknowledge that in addition to these adjustments, we also looked at peak hour spreading. Peak hour spreading is the trend that is happening when vehicles or drivers encounter congestion during peak hour. So this is your traditional perhaps 8 to 9 in the morning or 4 to 5 in the afternoon. If drivers experience some congestion, they may choose to drive in the shoulders of the peak. And the shoulders of the peak would be either 1 hour before or 1 hour after that peak hour. This peak hour spreading is already occurring today. And for myself, I live in the area of the KDA, and every day I make decisions as to when I would leave to work. And this includes whether dropping off kids at school or heading to work. And I also make choices in terms of which road network I choose. Because the network in this area is a grid network, especially for the arterial road, it's possible that every day drivers are making decisions whether they use a certain left turn or they go through the intersection and make a left turn somewhere else. So in combination with peak spreading and changing patterns, these also reduce the amount of traffic that would occur at intersections and road network throughout the KDA as well as throughout the broader network. And to account for these continuing trends, we also reduce and applied a reduction of 10% to our forecast volumes in 2041. When we looked at our evidence to back up those changes, we found many roads throughout the region as well as the GTA that are already exhibiting these trends of reductions due to peak spreading and to the fact of spreading out and choosing different choices in travel routes throughout the region. Next, I'd like you to proceed to 4.7, future total conditions on page 57. So in this section, we want to highlight that the starting point of our road network assumptions and analysis is the 10-year capital program, as well as the improvements that the region has for beyond 10 years, which are analyzed or contained in their transportation master plan. On top of that network, our purpose was to determine if any additional improvements would be required on the arterial network, as well as to look at the starting point for the KDA, which was the BA's recommended proposed network. As Mr. Teske stated already, there were some minor changes made in terms of the assumptions in our network. And this is detailed on exhibit 4-22 on page 59. So a minor adjustment that we want to highlight was link A. Originally, it connected between Yonge Street and Yorkland, and it was modified to complete the ring road to now have an alignment that connects Yonge Street to Bernard. And the aforementioned justice connection is shown as well, which we'll speak to in phase 2. So in terms of the starting point, we took this network into our analysis to determine what other improvements would be needed, if any. Next, I'd like to bring your attention to the next section, which is the KDA site trip generation and forecast. This is on page 61 of the HDR report.
And Mr. Wang, before we go there, just looking at figure 4-22, is that then what the road network that is recommended out of your report that we see in that figure?
Correct. In terms of the general alignments and the road, it is the same recommendation as our network.
Thank you.
So on page 61, Table 4-15 highlights and summarizes the various population and job yields for residential for residential units, and what the people and jobs would be created based on those residential units, as well as the commercial and the office component for employment. And we also made a comparison to what that would look like under 2031 as well as 2041 build-out conditions. And we want to note that in terms of the change in land use, by 2041, we would see approximately 14,000 people and jobs compared to 2031, which would be around 10,000 people and jobs. Now, this change, while may be significant in terms of the absolute number, a net difference about 38 to 4,000, not all of the changes in population translate to a linear effect or impact on the road network. And we want to take a look at also table 4-16 on page 62. So in terms of the comparison of what we are analyzing in the current study versus what BA analyzed in for 2031, this shows that there's various changes to the units or the components of the land use. For residential, our 2031 was actually slightly less than BA's 2031 number, but in terms of the 2041, we're 24% higher than the previous analysis. And in terms of the office and retail, we're respectively 259 and 46% higher compared to the previous BA numbers. Again, even though these percentages may be high, we also will take a look at how these translate to the road network, and it's not a linear impact. The other thing to note is that an increase in office is actually beneficial to the KDA because they would generate trips in the opposite direction of the peak demands, especially in the morning. The morning, as residents are heading out to work or heading out to various destinations, they're generating traffic primarily in the southbound direction or in the eastbound direction towards Bayview, Leslie, or Highway 404. However, in terms of office trips, they're actually heading into the KDA, and therefore they would not contribute to the congestion or to the peak direction. And so any increases in office is actually good for the KDA and for balancing the directions of traffic on the road network. And the same case for retail trips as well. Next, I'd like to take you through to table 4-18 on page 63. This table summarizes our transit mode split assumptions for 2031. And the following table on the same page, 4-19, shows the 2041 assumptions. So I wanted to highlight the 2041 because this is where we show the 30% that's been the subject of various issues and comments. The 30% that we see in this table is the residential transit mode split. And this also shows what the implications would be on drivers, auto passengers, as well as walking and cycling, what our mode split assumptions are. We like to point out that for the office and retail, the mode split is not 30%. We were conservative in allocating a lower mode split for transit to these other uses. The net effect is that the mode split, when considered as a whole, would actually be less than 30%. And as well, we were conservative in our walking and cycling, subject to more future detailed studies that each application or development application would do. They may take a different approach to these mode splits, but in terms of our recommendation and our assumptions on the 30%. It's focused on the residential and reducing the auto drivers and auto passengers and shifting them to transit based on the BRT and the future transit services that would be provided in this study area. Next, I would like to take you to a summary of what this all means when we look at the differences in land use and what it means by looking at the various reductions we had for mode split. And table 4-22 on page 67 provides a good summary of that impact. I'd like to point you to scenario 3 of that table. And this scenario is the one that we are looking at for FSI with a 30% mode split, and to see what the implications are compared to previous forecasts undertaken by BA and the forecast that we've included in our analysis. When you take a look at the AM outbound traffic, we are showing 1,418 trips. And when we compare that to the actual forecast that were developed by BA for FSI, we're only 55 trips higher. And that is a product of the higher mode split, as well as the fact that, as I mentioned, the land use increases in the population jobs doesn't necessarily translate to a linear impact on the road network. When we consider the opposite directions of travel for retail and office, and the mode splits that we apply for retail, we're only generating 55 trips more than the 2031 original case that BA analyzed. And when you compare that with when you consider it in the two-way scheme or scenario, yes, we're generating 500 trips more, but most of those are in the inbound direction. Again, this is to do with the office trip generation. Most of those trips are heading into the KDA as opposed to out of the KDA, and does not contribute to any of the peak direction movements or congestion that might be experienced on residential trips. Next, I'd like you to proceed to page 74 and 75 of the report. This is just a recap of the adjustments that we highlighted before for mode split, peak spreading, left turn diversion. We want to note that while adjustments were made for the background traffic before we developed and assigned the KDA traffic, these adjustments are also applicable to the KDA traffic. KDA traffic has the ability to also deal with or make choices in regard to how they make left turns, whether they travel during the peak or during the shoulders of the peak. And of course, how their mode split would apply to them as well as they make choices, whether they take transit or drive. And then when we consider both background and KDA traffic having travel with these trends, we are then taking that account when we are looking at the specific intersection analysis that's documented in page 79. If you proceed to page 79, on that page, there is a table 4-29 that summarizes the intersection performance of the various KDA intersections. And the information provided in this table includes volume to capacity ratios, short for VRC, the level of service, delay, and queues. We looked at the combination of the various performance measures to determine whether the road network is appropriately accommodating the 4 FSI. And where a VRC of less than 1 appears, we are comfortable that there's sufficient road network capacity. Throughout the analysis that we are summarizing in this table, which extends to page 82, we acknowledge that there will be some particular and specific turning movements that we do or will exhibit VRC ratios that are higher than 1. This means that there may be some movements that may experience higher levels of delay or congestion. And there are certainly opportunities for this traffic to be, or to these turning moments to be mitigated with additional measures. As mentioned, there's going to be an opportunity where each development application will have to submit further studies. And at that time, they can indicate or they could advise of additional TDM measures or other more localized improvements that could resolve these specific movements. But when we consider a total year forecast and when we consider a broader study area approach, it is understandable that we would not expect to have every movement with a VRC under 1. And we also like to point out that most of these VRCs are 1 to 3% higher than the capacity, which indicates that most of these changes are within daily fluctuations of traffic, which could vary by as much as 5% on a daily basis. We also want to point out one particular intersection, which was a subject of public comments, was to analyze the intersection of Yonge Street and Major Mackenzie to see what the implications of the KDA had on further downstream impacts at this intersection. And we note that, yes, there's particular movements that are going to experience some congestion and increased delay. That delay we summarize in the southbound direction is a delay that they would experience today at around 40 seconds. And the delay in 2041 with the congestion would increase up to 75 seconds. And so the VRCs are not the only measure to look at or for the region and the city to indicate that a network is sufficient to accommodate the demand. They also look at the incremental delay. They also look at whether there's opportunities, whether there's any constraints in terms of potential additional mitigation, and to see whether there's additional capacity elsewhere in the network for these trips to make their movements. And as noted, with a grid network, you have multiple choices to, if you choose, to avoid this intersection by using alternative roads. Next, I'd like to take you through to page 87. So on page 87, we have heard that the public road network, which also includes recommendation on traffic controls, we also did a sensitivity analysis. What if we removed or changed some of our assumptions on the future road network? And in this case, we performed an analysis where we, in response to comments, what if we removed the signalization north of Bernard at Yonge for link D and E? And so we basically demonstrate that at a high level, there would be potential impacts to the rest of the public road network, that if you make changes to some intersections, there's an obvious impact to the remaining intersections in terms of how that traffic would distribute itself. Yeah, any further details will be considered in phase 2, but we want to highlight that traffic controls and the segments of the public road network are part and parcel of an integrated network that has to be considered as a whole. And next, I'd like to take you to page 91, 4.7.7. In this section, this is the key input that we are providing to the holding provision. In this section, we undertook a sensitivity analysis of what would happen if we didn't reach the 30% transit mode split that we applied for residents, and what would happen if the road improvements didn't occur in regard to Bathurst Street widening. Bathurst Street widening was one of those improvements that were in the transportation master plan for the region, but was not in the 10-year capital program. In our analysis of Bathurst Street, we determined that the widening would have a great significant benefit to Yonge Street and the KDA because it would be available to divert traffic away from Yonge Street, which means that there would be more capacity for the KDA and for more local traffic to use Yonge Street. And at the same time, as we consider the public road network that connects to Yonge Street will be able to handle more traffic that are being collected by the proposed collector and local network within the KDA to eventually use Yonge Street to head to other arterial roads such as Elgin Mills and Major Mackenzie Drive. So in this section, using our transportation model approach, we undertook a sensitivity of removing these elements and to see what the model would provide. And through iteration analysis, we determined that if you kept the mode split to be 17% instead of a 30%, we determined that, and this is shown on page, I would say on page 93, exhibit 4-33. If we took or reduced the high mode share, we want to see what that would have on the implications of the various screen lines and the arterial road network. And even though there might be localized issues for particular links or intersections, we note the entire screen line shows green, which means that the screen line and the road network that comprises that screen line would be able to accommodate the differences in assumptions. So 4-33 shows the mode split based on 30%, and then we'll see what happens when we adjust it down. And that's documented in in 4-35, exhibit 4-35. So 4-35 is as noted in the title, it's based on a base mode split of 17%. So when we looked at 30% in the previous exhibit and looked at base mode split in this, we determined that as long as the screen lines are green, we're determining whether that's sufficient to accommodate the mode split. In this case, we're looking at 2031, just to demonstrate that yes, we're basically contending that the agreement to BA's analysis, which originally looked at 2031 base mode split, this analysis shows that we're basically agreeing with BA's analysis that 2031 at base mode share 17% is sufficient. However, at 2041 at the higher mode split, we're basically showing that we need the higher mode split in order to keep all the screen lines green, as shown in the previous exhibit of 4-33. In the next major sections of the chapter, and I'll come back to the phasing analysis because it's summarized in the conclusions of the report. and I'll provide some additional clarifications. But in the remaining chapters, chapter 5 and chapter 6, we document the future transit and active transportation recommendations. Just quickly on chapter 5, future transit, one of the key questions that were asked of us is whether the BRT could handle all the transit trips that would be generated by the KDA, especially when we make an assumption of 30%. So what this chapter documents is that if we convert or translate 30% of all the KDA traffic into transit, and for them to use the BRT, we determined that on page 98, table 5-1, it shows that we have 971 two-way trips on Viva and 135 trips on the YRT. Based on these volumes, the Viva BRT will be able to accommodate these transit trips from the KDA, as well as the background transit trips that would be passing through the KDA. We also recognize and understand that the region, in responding to demand, they will adjust services and fleet requirements as needed to accommodate the increasing transit usage over time. In terms of the active transportation network, our summary based on the BA recommendation was to look at a more detailed investigation of the inventory. And we basically concluded that there are some deficiencies of the active transportation network today, in terms of some streets having gaps of no sidewalk or only one side sidewalk. And we also looked at the KDA in terms of connectivity with the existing neighborhood. And to summarize this finding, I would take you to page 108, Exhibit 6-8. So this exhibit summarizes the level service as measured in the various colors from green to red, indications where we could have opportunities to improve the active transportation network. As we can see, when we look at Bernard and Canyon Hill, it's showing level service D. And when we look at some of the other connecting streets, we're level service E or F. And when we consider the KDA, which is smack in the middle of this Yonge and Bernard intersection, we definitely see opportunities for better connections of the active transportation network that would connect the residential neighborhoods and parks to the KDA, and to provide some additional crossing of Yonge Street. And this leads us to our recommendation in Exhibit 6-9 on page 111. In this exhibit, we show our recommendation that the ring road network and public network should accommodate future sidewalks on both sides of the street, primarily for links G, A, D, and E, and for other streets to have at least one sidewalk on one side of the road. And with this network, we can see that now the KDA, as well as the existing neighborhoods to the west and east and north and south, would have better connections to the KDA, as well as the KDA will have better connections within itself in terms of crossing Yonge Street on a public road network consisting of sidewalks, and also crossing Bernard and Canyon Hill through these various sidewalks on both sides. In terms of the cycling network, we also have similar recommendations that are documented in Exhibit 6-17 on page 127. Similar to the sidewalk, we are also recommending cycling facilities on the internal proposed road network, within the KDA, as well as to also propose additional shared roadways for cyclists, also within the KDA and connecting to existing facilities that are already on Yorkland, Kenyon Hill, and Bernard.
Excuse me, Mr. Wang. Do you
Yes.
mean by cycling improvements, actual bike lanes or not?
Yes, they constitute various levels, of which, yes, bike lanes would be part of those, as well as shared facilities where you just put a pavement marking. Yes. On top of this, we also recognize that the city has recommended additional greenways or linear parks that would also accommodate off-street cycling facilities, and we'll see these on other maps. The parking chapter will be addressed by a different panel, and that takes us to sort of the last two chapters, which is chapter 8 on page 137. This is just to highlight changes to our draft report. So in addition to addressing comments, there was a slight change in the boundary of the KDA to encompass the recommended road network. This has no changes to our conclusions as well as to the analysis that we conducted. And just to highlight the changes that have occurred since the draft report, we did receive comments that included, again, the justice connection, and that led us to a change in recommendation from public to private, which we'll address further in phase 2. But we also looked at any additional information that we could provide in terms of safety, which I've gone through, providing information on the collisions for both regional and local roads. We also provided the information on the sensitivity analysis that we conducted in response to comments on the signal, to see what that does to the rest of the network. And we also updated our report based on feedback in regards to public comments on providing more information on the analysis in regards to the phasing. And so with that, I'd like you to take you to our last chapter, conclusions and recommendations. And in this chapter, we basically highlight the key elements that we recommend as part of the future network to accommodate the KDA, and to conclude that we could accommodate a higher FSI equivalent to going from 3 to 4 FSI. In summary, we're proposing the same network that BA proposed with 2 key changes. The link A now connecting Bernard and Yonge Street instead of continuing to Yorkland. The justice connection, as I mentioned. In terms of very specific localized intersections, they also recommended certain turning movements, right turns at Yonge Street and Elgin Mills, which today is not there because of the BRT construction, but the region acknowledges that over time, when warranted, they'll look at changes to any improvements on Yonge Street that might involve right turns in addition to the current cross-section. We also summarized here the transportation network in terms of active and transit. And for the transit, we're recommending to support the 30% that we would have a more frequent service to connect to the GO station. So not only is the BRT the only rapid transit facility nearby, there's also the GO transit station at Richmond Hill GO, that's on Newkirk, just southeast of our study area. Currently, there's a lot of car traffic that heads to the GO station, and the parking lot is full. But there's definitely opportunities to improve the local transit service to bring people from the KDA to the GO station to also continue to support the encouragement to make the modal shift from autos to transit. In addition to our findings of road network, transit, and active transportation, we are also commenting or summarizing here that the 30% is an achievable target based on the fact that today on Bayview, Bathurst, and Yonge Street, the current mode split is already 10% today, just based on the current service that you have. There's no transit lanes on Bayview and Bathurst, and they're already achieving 10%. So in the future, when the region is looking at implementing transit priority and HOV lanes on any streets they widen in the future, including Bathurst and Bayview, it is very achievable to achieve the 20% mode split. On Yonge Street, with the BRT as well as the access to the GO station and the local services, it is very achievable to go from today's mode split of approximately 12%, which is measured in 2016, to the 30% that we're proposing by 2041. There is many cases of existing examples where 30% has already been achieved on corridors with only one rapid transit, but we want to note that yes, this is not just one rapid transit, but also includes the GO station adjacent to our study area. And lastly, I want to highlight the table 9-1, which is again a summary of the sensitivity analysis that we did in regard to the various FSI that we tested with 17% mode split instead of 30, and without the Bathurst street widening. So table 9-1 again is a key input to the holding provision. And based on our sensitivity analysis that it's contained in our appendices as well as summarized in our report, we are basically looking at a scaling down of what could transpire or what could be developed in the KDA if you did not achieve these elements. So starting with scenario 1, we are basically looking at if you had 30% transit mode split on Yonge Street and 20 on Bathurst and Bayview, as long as you're also providing the 10-year capital program and Bathurst widening, you could achieve that for FSI, which translates to approximately 14,000 jobs and people in jobs. However, if you're only able to achieve 17% mode split, which is very modest by 2041, and you still have the same improvements, we are concluding based on sensitivity analysis, you're only able to achieve 3.8 FSI, or the equivalent of about 13,400 residents and jobs. So without the reduction or without the shift of transit, the KDA is only able to accommodate about 95% of its ultimate capacity. And further on in scenario 3, we also did a case where, okay, if we achieve 30% but didn't have Bathurst widening, what would that have on the KDA in terms of implications? And that's where we show that if you did that sensitivity analysis using our model and screenline approach, you would be able to achieve 90% of the KDA resident and jobs, or about 12,650. And based on what we already presented in our screenline analysis, we already show that an FSI of 3 was achievable at 70% mode split and the 10-year program. Recall that screenline graph where the screenline graphic where we already showed the screen lines all being green, it basically confirms that BA's analysis and recommendations are supportable by our updated analysis, that if all were achieved with 70% mode split and capital program, you could achieve 10,400 residents and jobs based on that 3 FSI.
Thank you, Mr. Wang. Mr. Chair, this might be an appropriate time for a lunch break with your direction. We're at a natural stopping point in this panel's evidence.
Same time as yesterday, 45 minutes?
Say 1:30.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.